You ever think you finally earned some peace, only to watch it get snatched away in the dumbest, most unbelievable way possible? 5 years ago, I built my dream home on 9 acres of Colorado hillside, surveyed, stamped, notarized, perfect. So, imagine my face when the HOA president marched onto my porch and told me my house was sitting on their land. I laughed. Until the survey team found something worse. Her entire $1 million mansion, pool, patio, guest house was actually built on my property, and the court let me take it all back. When I retired from federal land inspection, I thought the hardest years of my life were behind me. 20 years dealing with bureaucrats who couldn't read a plat map, shady developers who pretended they could, and surveyors who conveniently lost boundary lines whenever money was involved. Well, that'll wear a man down. So when I hung up my badge, I swore I'd spend whatever time I had left in a place where the only lines I cared about were the ones drawn by the mountains and the wind. That place turned out to be 9 acres of rugged Colorado hillside, just outside Grand Junction. Land that used to belong to a logging outfit back in the 70s. The kind of land where the ground feels old under your boots, and every pine tree creaks like it remembers more winters than you ever will. I didn't buy it impulsively. Oh no. I did what a federal inspector does best. I tore that property apart on paper long before I ever stepped foot on it. Every corner pin, every turning point, every boundary shift. Marked, dated, notarized, elevation profiles, soil records, historic surveys going back 40 years. I even ran a cross-check through 2 separate agencies. When I say I made sure the deed was clean, I mean you could have eaten Sunday dinner off it. When I finally signed the papers, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Relief, the good kind, the kind that makes your shoulders drop. Then I built the house I'd been sketching on bar napkins during every boring government conference since '98. 2 stories, pine beams, a wraparound porch big enough for 3 rocking chairs and a stubborn old dog, workshop underneath, a viewing terrace where you can watch storms roll in from Utah like slow, gray freight trains, and best of all, no neighbors, no rules, no committees, just the silence of the hills and the whistle of wind through the pines. Most mornings, I'd sit out there with my first cup of coffee, listening to the world before it woke up. Sometimes a hawk would cut across the valley. Sometimes a coyote would trot the ridge like it owned the place. My only job was to appreciate it. For a while, that was all I needed. A quiet house on solid land. A view that changed with the seasons. Enough space between me and the nearest property line to forget what it felt like to argue with anyone. And I'll be honest with you, I really thought that was how the rest of my life would go. But trouble has a funny way of arriving right when you start believing you're safe from it. And in my case, trouble rolled in behind the wheel of a platinum-colored luxury SUV, wearing sunglasses bigger than her personality and carrying a clipboard like it was a scepter. I didn't know it then, but the peace I thought I'd earned was about to turn into the biggest land fight of my entire career. And it wasn't going to happen in a courtroom first. It was going to start right at the edge of my porch, with the woman who would soon become the most dangerous HOA president I'd ever met. I first met Karen Hasslinger the way you meet a sudden gust of wind on a calm day. Surprising, intrusive, and carrying a chill that doesn't belong. It was early summer, warm morning, soft sunlight on the ridge, the kind of day when the world feels honest. I was tightening a hinge on the workshop door when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, slow, deliberate, like someone rehearsing their entrance. I looked up, and there she was. A platinum silver SUV, polished so bright it looked allergic to dirt roads. Out steps a woman wearing sunglasses big enough to double as riot shields, and carrying a slim little dog that trembled like it hadn't been outside in years. She was dressed in one of those outfits that screams, "I don't get my hands dirty." She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she didn't even look at the house. Instead, she glanced at a folder in her hand, then at me, then back at the folder, like she was matching a suspect to a description. "Good morning," she said, in a voice too cheerful to trust. "I'm Karen Hasslinger, president of the Blue Haven Ridge Homeowners Association." I just stared at her, took a sip of my coffee. "I'm not part of your HOA," I said, calm, friendly, informational. Her smile didn't budge. "Oh, I'm aware, but sometimes community standards extend beyond formal membership. We're all neighbors here. I thought that was the end of it. A strange introduction, but folks with too much time and too many rules like to feel important. I figured she just wanted to welcome herself. But she turned, reached into her SUV, and pulled out a gold-embossed envelope, held it between two fingers like she was presenting an award. Then she set it on the corner of my porch rail and said, "A small note about your garage door." That was the first letter, and the beginning of everything that would come after. That evening, I opened it at my kitchen table. The letter was typed, formatted, and watermarked like a wedding invitation. The message was short. Your garage door color does not align with the visual harmony standards of the Blue Haven Ridge community. Please repaint within 14 days. I read it twice. Then I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my drink. I lived 300 feet outside their boundary line. My land was older than their development. My deed didn't include a single clause about visual harmony. And I sure as hell didn't sign anything that required the approval of a woman with a clipboard and a dog the size of a lunchbox. Into the fireplace it went. But, as older folks like to say, 1 letter is a mistake, 2 letters is a pattern, 3 letters is a problem. A week later, another envelope appeared, this time slipped under the workshop door. Fence height exceeds community uniformity guidelines. Uniformity for a community I didn't belong to. Into the fire. Then came the third. Your tool shed is visible from certain rear-facing windows of nearby community residences. Please conceal or relocate. Into the fire. Then the fourth. A complaint about my gravel driveway being aesthetically disruptive during sunrise hours. Into the fire, but each letter grew longer, more formal. And somewhere between the complaints about my porch lights and the slope of my land, her tone changed. She stopped writing like a neighbor with concerns, and started writing like someone preparing a file. You can smell when trouble is coming, especially when you've spent 20 years dealing with people who bend the truth until it screams. Karen wasn't just annoyed, she was building something, a story, a narrative, a case. And though I didn't know it yet, every one of those ridiculous letters was a brick in the foundation of the war she was preparing to start. The kind of war that doesn't begin with shouting, but with paperwork that smells like perfume and bad intentions. By the time the fourth letter burned to ash in my fireplace, I figured Karen had finally run out of creative ways to complain about things that weren't her business. Turns out, she was just warming up. The real turning point arrived on a sharp October morning, one of those Colorado days when the air tastes like cold metal and the sky is too blue to be real. I was in my workshop, turning a piece of juniper on the lathe, when I heard tires roll over my gravel drive. Not the slow, unsure roll of a neighbor. No. This was the stiff, official kind. The kind that says someone brought paperwork. I wiped the sawdust from my hands, stepped outside, and stopped cold. Karen was standing at the bottom of my steps, wearing a navy blue pantsuit that looked like it had never been outdoors. Beside her was a young man, mid-20s, maybe early 30s, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, and clutching a cheap leather briefcase like it was about to explode. The kid cleared his throat. "Thomas Edgington?" I nodded. He opened his briefcase with hands that shook a little and pulled out a slim folder. "You've, been served." He held it out to me, the way a zookeeper might hold out meat to a hungry lion. Karen didn't smile. She looked too satisfied for that. Her expression was something sharper, like she'd been waiting for this moment. I took the folder. "What is this?" "Formal notice," she said. "From the Blue Haven Ridge Homeowners Association." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm not in your HOA. "Legally irrelevant," she replied. And that was the moment I knew. Karen wasn't confused. She wasn't petty. She was strategic. I opened the folder right there on the porch. The first page looked official enough. Lots of bold headings, legal wording, signatures, a violation summary, whatever that meant. But the second page was where the stupidity really took flight. A map, not a survey, not a plat, not a document with a single legitimate coordinate on it. A screenshot of Google Earth, covered in crooked red lines, drawn in something that could have been Microsoft Paint or a child's crayon. And beside it, a typed statement. Property known as the Edgington Residence encroaches 24 feet into the Blue Haven Ridge Association's legally designated lands. Encroaches, like my house had sprouted legs and wandered downhill without asking permission. I looked up at Karen, then back at the map, then back at her. "You're accusing me of building my home On your land? On community land, she corrected. And we're giving you an opportunity to resolve this amicably. Amicably, I repeated, deadpan. And how do you suggest I do that? She handed me another sheet, this one highlighted like a middle school textbook. It demanded that I cease unauthorized occupation, restore encroached land to community conditions, submit a proposal for voluntary transfer of improvements. Improvements, by the way, meant my garage, part of my workshop roof, and a six-figure chunk of my home's foundation. I stared at her. You think I built my house on someone else's land? Her expression was pure, polished arrogance. Oh, not someone else's, she said. The community's. And you did your due diligence before accusing me of theft? We conducted a thorough internal review. She handed me a color printout of the same mangled map. Visual estimation based on updated boundary interpretations. I laughed, an honest, involuntary laugh that echoed off the ridge. Karen, I said, you've got 20 seconds to get off my property before I call the sheriff. The kid in the cheap suit stepped back 2 feet. Karen didn't flinch. We'll be following up shortly, she said. You just did, I replied. Now walk. And she walked, but not before turning toward the road and raising her voice just enough for the neighbor's Ring camera to pick it up. You'll regret making this difficult. I didn't know it then, but that sentence, those 7 smug little words, were the spark that would light the fuse on the biggest land fight of my entire life. It wasn't about a complaint anymore, or a misunderstanding, or an HOA president with too much time on her hands. It was about a woman who believed she could redraw the world with a marker, a map, and a lie. And she was about to learn that some lines, especially property lines, don't move just because you want them to. After Karen left my porch with her thin smile and her cheap hired messenger, I stood there for a long moment with that ridiculous packet of papers in my hands. I'd seen a lot of bad maps in my 20 years inspecting federal lands, but this was something else. This was incompetence wearing the mask of authority, and that's the most dangerous kind. I set the papers on my workbench, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and opened the top drawer of an old metal filing cabinet. Inside were the documents that brought me more comfort than any Bible ever could. My original land surveys. Surveyors call them the bones of the earth. I call them the truth. But here's the thing. When someone hands you a fake boundary map, even a laughably bad one, it triggers an instinct, a tension behind the ribs, like a whisper saying, check, verify, confirm. And I did. Right after lunch, I grabbed my handheld GPS unit, an old Trimble model I'd used back when the federal government still bought quality equipment, and headed out toward the southern boundary of my land. Not because I doubted my surveys, but because I doubted Karen's intentions. The air was cold, crisp, and clean enough to taste. The pine needles underfoot snapped softly as I walked. I followed the ridgeline down toward the first boundary marker, the one set back in 20 when I finalized the purchase. And right away, immediately, the GPS chirped. A small beep, nothing dramatic. But if you've used one of those devices long enough, you know the difference between a normal position drift and a reading that's pulling you somewhere it shouldn't. I slowed down, adjusted my stance, let the machine settle. Beep, beep, beep. 3 beeps in a row, each one louder than the last as the accuracy zone tightened. That's not right, I muttered. The reading was off by 5 feet. Maybe 6, not much, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. Markers don't drift. Coordinates don't wander. Boundaries aren't polite suggestions. They're recorded in the county like the 10 Commandments. I crouched down and brushed away a layer of pine needles. There it was. A faint circular impression in the soil. Soft, freshly filled, not yet compacted by weather or time. Someone had pulled a boundary pin, and then put it back, in the wrong spot. For a long moment, I just stared at it, because you don't accidentally move a boundary pin. You don't casually dig one up the way you pull a weed. Boundary pins are hammered into the ground like nails into the spine of the earth. They're meant to stay. But I didn't stop there. I walked farther along the slope, letting the GPS guide me. Every 30 or 40 feet, the device would chirp again, each time a little more urgently, like a dog trying to get its owner's attention. And then I found the second hole, then the third, each one a small scar in the soil where a marker once stood. each one a few feet off from its rightful location. That's when the realization settled in my bones. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't incompetence. This was tampering. Someone, most likely at Karen's direction, had walked the boundary, lifted the pins, and reset them to create the illusion that her land extended farther than it did. And they hadn't just adjusted one marker. They'd shifted multiple turning points, the spots where property lines bend and shift with the terrain. A novice wouldn't know to touch those. Someone gave them instructions. I stood on that slope, cold wind coming down from the ridge, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my federal days, the old fire. The one that burned when someone tried to cheat a system I spent my life defending. Karen hadn't just crossed a line, she tried to erase it. I took photos of every disturbed spot, logged coordinates, marked positions. By the time the sun dipped low behind the pines, I had enough irregularities recorded to know one thing for certain. The letter she served me wasn't the opening move. It was the first time she got caught, and if she thought a bad map or a moved pin could scare me off, she was about to learn just how stubborn a retired land inspector can be. 2 days after I found those disturbed markers along my southern slope, the real professionals arrived, right on schedule, right at sunrise, in 2 white trucks with the Rocky Vista Geomatics logo stenciled on the doors. If you've ever watched a team of surveyors climb out of a truck, you know the look. No nonsense, heavy boots, coffee in hand, eyes already scanning the terrain before their feet hit the dirt. These weren't clipboard warriors like Karen. These were people who listened to the land. They could read a hillside the way a doctor reads an X-ray. The crew chief was a solid, square-shouldered man named Levi. I'd worked with him a decade back on a nasty boundary dispute involving a crooked developer and 40 acres of misfiled forest land. Back then, Levi could hike 6 miles in snow and still hold a laser receiver steadier than a surgeon's scalpel. He hadn't changed much. "Morning, Tom," he said, shaking my hand the way old colleagues do, firm, simple, respectful. "Got your files, got your notes. We'll take it from here." That right there is something beautiful. A real expert who doesn't need drama, doesn't need theatrics, doesn't need 3 meetings to get started. Just give him the land and the truth, and he'll sort them out. The men unloaded their gear, tripods with laser heads, GPS receivers the size of lunchboxes, reflector poles, soil probes, and a drone case with a LiDAR unit worth more than my truck. They spread out like a small military operation. Each person knew where to stand, what to set up, what angle to sight. No wasted movements, no chit-chat, just the quiet symphony of people who respected precision. I gave them space. Surveyors don't like shadows on their backs. From the upper terrace, I watched them move from marker to marker, checking depths, reading pins, measuring offsets, logging coordinates with those meticulous, almost ceremonial gestures only surveyors seem to have. For 3 peaceful hours, nothing happened. No drama, just data. Just truth whispering up from the earth. Then, a little before noon, I heard a knock on the workshop door. It was Levi. He doesn't waste words, never has. "Mind coming with me?" he asked. We walked down the slope together, pine needles crunching under our boots. He stopped at one of the boundary points near a decorative shrub line that edged Karen's yard. There, at my feet, sat the original 20 pin. Weathered, aged, exactly where the county said it should be. Levi tapped it lightly with his boot. "Confirmed by GPS within 1 inch, he said. "So far so good?" I asked. He gave me a look. "Not exactly." We walked another 20 feet downhill. Levi knelt and pulled back a thick curtain of ivy that had grown over a low rock wall. Underneath, half buried in the soil like someone hoped no one would ever look there, was another boundary pin. This one was shiny, new, wrong. Levi pointed to it with the end of his probe. "Whoever placed this one," he said, "was off by about 30 feet. 30 feet? That's not a mistake. That's a strategy." He pulled out his tablet and tapped the screen. A digital overlay popped up. My original recorded boundaries in blue and their new field data overlaid in red. "Here's where it gets interesting," he said. I looked, and my stomach dropped. Karen's entire backyard, her expanded patio, her enormous guest house, the edge of her infinity pool, all of it, rested not on her own parcel, but on nearly 8/10 of an acre of mine. Not a few inches, not a foot, not a rounding error. Almost a full acre. I let out a long breath through my teeth. "Levi, you're telling me..." That she's built close to $1 million worth of improvements on land she does not own? He nodded. Yep, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And the shifted markers? I asked. 5 of them moved, he said. All in a straight pattern. All moved in the direction that benefits her property. That doesn't happen by accident. I stared down at the overlapping red and blue lines again. She knew, I said quietly. Or someone working for her knew. Either way, intent was written all over the hillside. Levi slid his tablet back into its case. I'll have the certified report on your desk tomorrow. Everything signed, sealed, and ready for county review. Appreciate it, I said. He gave me a long, steady look. Tom, this is one of the clearest cases of boundary fraud I have seen in years. You're not just dealing with a bad neighbor. You're dealing with someone who thinks she can redraw the world to suit herself. I nodded. I was afraid of that. But truth be told, a small part of me, some old part from the inspector days, felt something else too. A spark, a steadiness, a familiar sense of purpose. Because now the land wasn't whispering anymore. It was speaking loud and clear. And I was going to answer. I didn't sleep much the night after Levi showed me that shifted pin hiding under the ivy. When you've spent years untangling land fraud, certain things settle deep in your bones. And that night, the feeling was unmistakable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a sloppy mistake. This was a scheme, and schemes always have footprints. I just didn't expect the first footprint to show up in my inbox at 6 in the morning. The message came from a man named Greg Porter. I recognized the name, one of the original homeowners in Blue Haven Ridge. He and I had only exchanged a few polite nods over the years, but he always struck me as level-headed, steady, the kind of man who knew the value of minding his own business. His email began simply, Tom, I think you should see this. Keep my name out of it. Below the line was a video attachment. I opened it, turned up the volume, and watched. It was a recording from a backyard security camera. Grainy, early morning, washed in that blue-gray color the world gets just before sunrise. The timestamp said 5:48 a.m., 3 months back. The camera showed 2 men in landscaping uniforms walking slowly along the edge of Karen's property. They weren't planting anything. They weren't trimming shrubs. They weren't carrying tools of the gardening kind. One of them held a long metal bar. The other carried a small bucket filled with dirt and something that looked suspiciously like survey stakes. The audio was faint, but one sentence came through clearly when the taller man pointed toward the slope. She said, "Move it a little farther. No one checks these anyway." I paused the video. I didn't need it enhanced. I didn't need better lighting. I didn't need faces. I had method, motive, and now a glimpse of means. Karen hadn't tripped over a mistake. She'd organized a quiet little dawn operation to move the markers into the positions she needed. And somehow, she'd forgotten there are 2 kinds of neighbors in the world, the ones who mind their own business, and the ones who record everything. But the morning wasn't done surprising me. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. I stepped outside to see a kid, 16 or 17, standing awkwardly by the porch steps, holding a drone controller. Sir, are you Mr. Edgington? I nodded. He swallowed hard and said, I think I have something you should see. His name was Ben. He lived a couple houses down from Karen's place. A quiet kid, pale, wearing a hoodie too big for him, and shoes that looked like they'd survived one summer too many. He held out a thumb drive like it weighed 20 pounds. I fly my drone a lot, he said, for school projects, for fun, sometimes just to take pictures of storms coming over the ridge. He looked away embarrassed. I wasn't spying or anything. It's all right, son, I said. What did you find? He clicked a few buttons on his controller, and the tiny drone screen lit up, showing a time-lapse stitched together from dozens of flights. The footage showed Karen's backyard over the course of 2 years, and what I saw made my jaw tighten. Her pool didn't appear all at once. It grew, slowly, deliberately. First a concrete pad, then a frame, then a deck, then a patio expansion, then another pour of concrete. But the real kicker, every few months, the entire structure crept a little farther toward my property line, like a glacier made of bad intentions. At one point in the time-lapse, a small retaining wall appeared almost overnight. Then, a month later, another shift. Then a new flower bed that conveniently covered what must have been one of the turning point markers. I exhaled slowly. Ben, this is incredible. Thank you. He hesitated. People in the HOA kept saying you were the problem, but it didn't look right. None of it did. I put a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing. When he left, I stood there with the thumb drive in my hand, the morning sun warming the pine needles at my feet. Between Greg's video, Ben's time-lapse, and Levi's hard data, the truth was no longer just under the surface. It was undeniable. It was mapped. It was measured. It was recorded from multiple angles. Karen hadn't just twisted the rules, she'd tried to twist the land itself. And as I watched the ridge catch fire in the rising sunlight, I felt something shift inside me, something steady, something old. The fight was no longer theoretical, it was real, and it was time to push back. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to warm the ridge, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of something far simpler, something older. A boundary is a promise, and a broken promise has to be repaired. I went back inside, sat down at my workshop bench with a pot of fresh coffee, and opened the steel file cabinet that had followed me through 2 decades of federal work. Inside were my records, precise, complete, boring to anyone except the kind of people who understand the power of a well-organized document. I pulled out the files, spread them across the table, and got to work. First step, file an encroachment dispute with the county. That meant submitting Levi's findings, photos of disturbed marker holes, and the original 20 survey. The clerk who answered the phone recognized my name. "Oh, it's you," she said. There was a pause. "Is this about Karen again?" I blinked. "Again?" Another pause. "Never mind. What do you need?" That right there was interesting. A thread I'd tug later. Second step, draft a cease and desist, 2 copies, one addressed to Karen herself, one addressed to the Blue Haven Ridge HOA as an entity. Both documents stated, in very polite legal language, that any continued use, expansion, or occupation of the disputed land would be treated as a willful trespass. It's amazing how powerful a simple sentence can be when you sign your name under penalty of perjury. Third step, file a preliminary claim of adverse occupation. That's a fancy way of saying, if no one contests this with real documentation in 30 days, it enters the public record as fact. And believe me, HOAs hate paperwork deadlines more than they hate non-uniform holiday decorations. Fourth step, upload everything to cloud storage, multiple backups, multiple devices. There's a reason 20 years in federal service trains you to treat evidence like treasure, because it is. Then came the final step of the morning, one I didn't plan, but one that felt necessary. You see, there's a certain kind of arrogance that thrives in the dark, in whispers, in little meetings behind closed doors. But there's another thing arrogance absolutely hates: sunlight. I logged into my Facebook account, an old one I mostly used to share photos of sunsets and stubborn tomatoes from my garden, and typed out a single sentence. Just one. If you're going to accuse someone of building on your land, make sure your house isn't built on theirs. I didn't include names. I didn't include details. I didn't have to. Folks around here know how to read between lines, especially when the lines involve land. I posted it, closed the laptop, went back to smoothing the edge of a cedar plank for a table I'd been making, and within 15 minutes, my phone started buzzing. By 20 minutes, it was vibrating across the workbench like a trapped cricket. By 30, the post had hundreds of likes, dozens of comments, and a few shares from people I didn't even know. Turns out truth has a way of traveling fast when you step aside and let it walk. A woman from the HOA messaged me privately. I knew she was hiding something. "Please keep going." A man asked, "Is this about the pool we all told her not to build?" One resident simply wrote, "Oh boy, Bizoa, this is gonna be good." And then someone forwarded me a screenshot, a thread from the private HOA message board. Karen was in full panic mode, accusing people of spreading disinformation, threatening to enforce community rules, claiming swift legal action was coming. It was the digital equivalent of watching a pot boil over in real time. But I didn't reply, didn't post an update, didn't add fuel, because I knew something Karen didn't. When you're lying, noise is your weapon. But when you're telling the truth, silence is nuclear. So I put down my tools, stepped outside, breathed in the crisp Colorado air, and listened to the wind push through the pines. Steady, Sure, ancient. The paperwork war had begun. But the real storm was still on its way. My Facebook post had been up for less than a day when the real unraveling began. Some people say the internet has made folks meaner. Maybe that's true, but it has also made lies travel slower than truth, once the right match hits the right pile of dry grass. By the next morning, the entire county seemed to know that something was brewing between me and the Blue Haven Ridge HOA. People at the hardware store asked me if I'd seen the post. Local ranchers stopped their trucks on the road to say, "Miss, heard you stirred up a nest of hornets." But the most telling sign came as a screenshot someone sent me of the HOA message board. Karen was furious. Paragraph after paragraph of polished panic. Disregard the misinformation. Boundary clarifications are internal matters. Unauthorized statements regarding HOA jurisdiction will be handled legally. Community unity is essential during this challenging time. Community unity. You'd think she was running a small nation. And, in a way, she thought she was. But fear does what fear always does. It makes people reckless. And Karen made her most reckless move 2 days later. It was a Sunday afternoon, clear and bright, with the kind of warm breeze that carries the smell of pine sap. I was out back tightening a loose hinge on the shed door when I heard laughter drifting across the ridge. Not normal laughter, crowd laughter. I stepped up onto the terrace and looked down toward the disputed boundary. My jaw tightened. Folding chairs. Decorative lanterns. A Bluetooth speaker. A long folding table covered in wine coolers and salads that looked like they'd never known dirt. 3 HOA board members in pastel polos. And right in the center of it all, Karen, wearing a sun hat large enough to shade an entire courtroom. They were having a barbecue on my land, my disputed land, my active legal case land. And if that wasn't bold enough, she'd invited the whole neighborhood. Parents, kids, people I'd never met. They were sipping white wine and chatting like they were attending some kind of open house. It was pure theater, a performance, a power play. "Look at us," she was saying, without saying a word. "We belong here. He doesn't." I watched in silence for a long moment. I didn't shout, didn't storm down there, didn't escalate. Because sometimes the best strategy is to let someone show the world who they really are. I walked back inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed the sheriff's office. "Sheriff's line, this is Deputy Mills," a calm voice answered. "Afternoon," I said. "I'd like to report an unauthorized group gathering on private land currently under active encroachment dispute." There was a pause. "Oh, is this about Blue Haven Ridge?" "Yep," I said. "We'll send a unit." I thanked her, hung up, and went back out to the terrace. What I didn't expect was the live stream. Apparently one of the residents had decided to broadcast the whole barbecue on Facebook with the title, HOA versus Land Guy, Grill Edition. By the time the sheriff's SUVs rolled up 40 minutes later, the live stream had over 1,000 viewers. People in the comments were choosing sides like it was the Super Bowl. I leaned on the railing and watched it unfold. 2 deputies approached Karen. You could practically see the annoyance radiating off her like heat waves off asphalt. She lifted her chin. "We are holding a community event on HOA-managed property," she declared, loud enough for every camera to catch it. The deputy held up a tablet, county parcel map glowing bright. "No, ma'am. According to the recorded boundaries, this area is not HOA property." Someone near the grill gasped. Someone else muttered, "I told her." Karen's face twitched. "We have documentation." The deputy's voice stayed level. "Ma'am, until this dispute is resolved, this land is under legal review. You and your guests need to step back across the boundary." Her sun hat wobbled. She waved a hand toward the guests. "Everyone stay where you are. This is false information." The deputy spoke with the patience of a man who had seen every version of suburban drama. "I'm going to ask again. Please step back." When she still didn't move, the second deputy joined him, and together they gently, but firmly, guided her a few steps uphill, clearly across the line. It was quiet for a second, eerily quiet. Then the live stream chat exploded. "OMG, this is wild. She's losing it. Is she serious right now? Tom was right. This is embarrassing." I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, but I did feel something shift. Not in me, in them, the neighbors, the community. A foundation cracks long before a house falls. This was her crack. As guests began to pack up their chairs and plastic wine cups, one man muttered loudly, "I told her this was a bad idea." Another woman shook her head, embarrassed, and ushered her kids back toward the trail. Karen stood alone for a moment, shoulders stiff, face red and trembling, before snapping at someone off camera, "This isn't over, not even close." And to her credit, she was right. This wasn't over. But she had just turned the county, the internet, and half her own neighborhood into witnesses. She had done the one thing I didn't expect. She proved my case for me, live, on camera, with a sun hat and a grill. And as the last of the guests wandered off, the field littered with a few forgotten napkins flapping in the breeze, I realized something important. Karen wasn't fighting for land anymore. She was fighting for control, for her image, for her kingdom, which meant the next battle wouldn't be on a hillside or at a BBQ. It would be in a courtroom. And I already had the truth on my side. The morning of the hearing felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was the autumn wind rolling down from the book cliffs. Maybe it was just the weight of everything that had led to this moment. When I walked into the courthouse, the place was already full. Neighbors from Blue Haven Ridge, local reporters, zoning interns clutching clipboards, and a handful of folks who just wanted to see a fight. I didn't go in angry. I went in prepared. Across the aisle, Karen made her entrance the way she lived her life, loud without making a sound. White blazer, hair lacquered stiff enough to survive a hurricane, lips pursed as if the entire room was beneath her. Her lawyer looked like a man who desperately wished he had a time machine. Judge Beatrice Lund took the bench, a woman who looked like she'd weathered 30 years of nonsense and had long since stopped tolerating any of it. She read the case summary, the claims, the filings, and then nodded for Karen's attorney to proceed. He stood, tugged his sleeves, and began his performance. Polite, polished, hollow. He blamed the developer. He blamed mapping inconsistency. He blamed clerical mistakes, shifting markers, misinterpretations. He blamed everything except the woman sitting 3 feet behind him. He said Karen had acted in good faith. He implied the whole thing was a misunderstanding, one that I had regrettably escalated. Then he sat down, adjusting his tie like he'd just delivered the Gettysburg Address. When my turn came, I didn't give a speech. I handed the judge the original 20 survey, then the independent GPS survey from Rocky Vista Geomatics, then the geospatial overlays, drone footage, photos, county records, correspondence, cease and desists. The HOA archive log showing Karen had checked out the official survey months before accusing me of trespassing. Every document was clean, stamped, notarized, unshakable. The judge flipped through them slowly, the way a jeweler inspects a diamond, turning it just so, checking the edges for flaws. She paused when she reached the overlay where Levi had placed the blue and red boundaries directly on top of one another. A full 0.8 acres of Karen's palace, pool, patio, guest house, sat squarely on my land. Then came the voicemail. Karen's own voice, sharp and irritated, filled the room. "Just keep pressure on him. He'll fold. That land's not worth much. He's just being difficult." You could have heard a pin drop. Her lawyer objected. The judge waved him off. Karen stared fixedly at the table, jaw tight enough to crack enamel. Then the county inspector testified. Calm, neutral, deadly. He confirmed. The guest house was illegally permitted as a tool shed. The patio had no permit at all. The pool was approved based on a false assumption of boundary lines. A zoning officer, who had recently resigned, had pushed paperwork through without due diligence. When he stepped down, the judge folded her hands and looked directly at Karen. Then she delivered a ruling so cold, so precise, it felt like watching a surgeon perform a clean amputation. She declared, "Karen knowingly built structures on my land. Karen knowingly ignored official surveys in her possession. Karen knowingly used falsified materials to pressure a neighboring landowner." Her voice never rose, but every word carried the weight of the mountain range outside. Then came the verdict. Karen was ordered, not asked, not encouraged, ordered, to demolish every structure encroaching onto my property. The pool, the patio, the outdoor kitchen, the guest house, every tile, every pipe, every piece of concrete she had proudly toured for real estate clients. She was required to restore the land to its original grade, remove all debris at her own expense, Submit to oversight of the demolition plan. Pay $820,000 in damages, legal fees, and punitive penalties. And Blue Haven Ridge HOA, they were placed under external audit for 1 year due to gross governance failures. When the gavel fell, the shockwave rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "Holy hell!" Another muttered, "She's done." Karen didn't look at me, not once. She just sat there frozen, like a statue carved out of pure denial. Outside, reporters swarmed me. I said only this: I just wanted my land respected. That's all. Then I walked down the courthouse steps into the cool Colorado air, knowing something important. The legal battle was over. But the consequences? They were just beginning. The weeks after the verdict rolled in the way winter storms do out here, slow at first, then suddenly heavy. Karen went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from dignity or acceptance. No, this was the kind of quiet that comes when a person realizes the world just turned its back on them, and the ground is starting to slide. The demolition order hit her like a sledgehammer. The pool alone would cost well over $100,000 to tear out. The patio? Another 50. The guest house had plumbing, electrical, concrete footers, none of it cheap. She couldn't sell the place, not with an active demolition mandate hanging over the property like a curse. Contractors quoted her numbers that would have made a rich man sweat. And Karen wasn't rich. She only played rich. Word around the ridge was that she tried everything: negotiating, pleading, even making calls to contacts nobody could quite identify. But the law is a machine, and by then it had already started grinding forward. Once a judge orders a teardown, the clock doesn't stop ticking just because someone's life is unraveling. The HOA didn't help her, not anymore. They were too busy trying to survive their own audit, too busy distancing themselves from the woman who had just dragged them into a regulatory swamp. 30 days passed, then 40, then 50. By day 63, Karen officially fell into default. When the demolition invoices hit her mailbox, she didn't open them. When late fees were added, she didn't answer the phone. When the county lien notice arrived, the HOA president, her successor, was the one who found it crumpled on a chair by her door. And then the bank stepped in. Mortgage unpaid, liens stacking, demolition costs looming, damages owed to me, permits frozen, title under legal dispute. No buyer in their right mind would touch that house. So, the bank did what banks do. They foreclosed. One cold morning, a notice went up on the edge of Blue Haven Ridge, plain, printed, taped to the HOA message board like someone posting a missing cat flyer. Foreclosure auction, public sale. Date, October 14th. Location, Mesa County Courthouse, property, 112 Falling Leaf Drive. Condition, as is. As is. 2 words that hid a world of ruin. When auction day arrived, I drove into town early, partly out of curiosity, partly out of something I didn't have a name for. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty, just 3 pickup trucks, a sedan with California plates, and a county vehicle. Inside, the auction room was even emptier. A young man from the bank sat with a laptop, tapping his pen against a clipboard. 2 men in flannels whispered in the back. Probably flippers hoping for a bargain until they saw the demolition order stapled to the property file. They walked out before bidding even began. A woman with a scarf over her shoulder browsed the papers, muttered, "Absolutely not," and disappeared. When the clock hit 10, there were only 2 registered bidders left, me, and a man who owned a local landscaping business, the kind of guy who would buy a wrecked property just to strip it for materials. The bank representative cleared his throat and began reading the legal description of the parcel. It took him almost 3 full minutes. The HOA had never made anything simple. Opening bid, $75,000. The landscaper scratched his chin and shook his head. A tear-down site with liens? Not worth it. He didn't raise his hand. The room went silent. I lifted mine. The banker blinked, relieved to have at least someone participating. 75,000. Do I hear 80? No answer. 75 going once. Silence. Twice, I raised a finger. 76. He nodded quickly. Bidding at 76. The landscaper hesitated for half a second, looked at me, looked at the file, then muttered, "All yours, buddy," and walked out. The banker barely contained his relief. Sold. 76,000. Congratulations, Mr. Edgington. I signed the paperwork calmly, but inside something shifted. Not triumph, not revenge, something steadier, like a final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't a victory lap, it was reclamation. You see, the whole property, Karen's house, the land it sat on, the structures half legal and half fraudulent, was a nightmare for anyone else. The permits were a disaster. The demolition order still stood. The boundaries were a mess, but, to me, it was the only piece of land on earth I understood down to the last blade of grass. I didn't need to fear the paperwork. I was the paperwork. By the time I walked out of the courthouse, the wind had picked up again, blowing dry leaves across the steps. I paused for a moment, watching them spin and scatter. Life is funny like that. Sometimes it tears things down so something better can grow. I didn't drive straight back home. I went to the ridge, pulled up in front of Karen's former palace, stared at the place where she'd hosted her wine mixers, the patio that wasn't hers, the pool she'd bragged about, the guest house she'd sold as luxury quarters. All of it empty now, all of it silent. Her fancy SUV was gone, her potted plants dead, the mailbox stuffed with papers she never opened. A house built on someone else's land always ends this way. Mine now. But I didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even go inside. I just looked at it and breathed, letting the moment settle. For the first time in my life, I understood something about justice. It doesn't always arrive fast. It definitely doesn't arrive pretty. But when it comes completely. And I wasn't done yet. I had plans for this place. Big ones. Plans that had nothing to do with Karen, and everything to do with the people who actually deserved a second chance. The storm had passed. Now it was time to build something worth the quiet. The day I took possession of the property, the first thing I noticed wasn't the house. It was the silence. Not the uneasy silence of conflict or tension, but something deeper, something clean. A kind of quiet that settles after a storm passes, and the air finally remembers what peace feels like. The demolition crews came and went over the next 3 weeks. Jackhammers, backhoes, dump trucks rolling down the ridge. They tore out the pool, the patio, the guest house foundations. They peeled everything down until the earth looked raw and honest again, a scar healing in its own time. I didn't supervise much. I just walked the perimeter each morning with a thermos of coffee, nodding to the crews, watching the land return to the shape it should have always had. Once the debris was hauled away, I called an old friend, Jack Trujillo. Jack had served with some of the toughest men I ever met. Smart, steady, quiet strength. After the service, he founded a nonprofit that helped combat veterans readjust to civilian life. Not therapy, not treatment, just a place to decompress and figure out how to breathe again. Years ago, over a beer, I had floated an idea. What if there was a space, a real place, somewhere peaceful, somewhere private, somewhere that didn't feel like a clinic? Jack loved the idea, but places like that don't appear out of thin air. Now, I had one. Jack, I said when he picked up the phone, I think I'm ready to talk about that project again. He didn't pause long. You finally got the land? I did. And the house that comes with it? That too. A beat. Then he said, I'll bring the team. They showed up with a van full of tools, a truck full of lumber, and that quiet, determined energy veterans carry like a second skin. For the next few months, the ridge echoed with the sounds of hammers, power drills, saws, and laughter. The kind of laughter men don't always realize they miss. We tore out the tacky pergola and the gaudy fixtures. We converted the guest rooms into small, comfortable living quarters. We built soundproof quiet rooms for those who needed a place to sit with their thoughts. We added blackout shades, a library nook, a big kitchen where folks could cook together if they wanted. And outside, we covered the pool pit, reinforced it, and turned it into a rooftop garden lined with planter boxes and a fire pit in the center. At night, we'd sit out there under the Colorado sky, vast, star-filled, humbling. The ridge stretched wide in the distance, the land breathing its slow, ancient breath. It wasn't just construction, it was transformation, not of the house, of purpose. The first 5 veterans arrived on a Friday, a Marine who couldn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time, an Army medic who kept his phone alarm set for emergencies that would never come, a Navy gunner's mate who hadn't stood in a quiet room in years without feeling trapped by the silence. Two others who didn't say much at first, just walked the property slowly, shoulders dropping inch by inch. They didn't need speeches, they didn't need rules, they just needed a place that felt steady. The moment they walked in, I felt something shift. Something I hadn't felt since I first started building my own house on that mountain. The land was being used for something good. One evening, about a week after the first group settled in, I stood out on the upper terrace as the sky turned gold. Jack walked up beside me, hands in his pockets, looking out across the ridgeline. He didn't say anything for a long time. The older you get, the more you learn that silence sometimes does the talking for you. Finally, he exhaled. "You know," he said, "places like this don't just happen. They're made." He nodded toward the house, where warm light spilled from the windows. "And this one's gonna save some lives." I didn't have much of a response, didn't need one. I just felt the truth settle in, heavy and gentle. The sun dipped lower, painting the ground in that amber glow Colorado does better than anywhere else. Down below, one of the veterans was tending the fire pit, coaxing a flame to life. Two others were carrying chairs out to join him. Another sat alone on the far edge of the terrace, looking out at the horizon like he was finally letting himself believe in something again. Watching them, I realized something that had taken me 50-some years to understand. Peace isn't the absence of trouble, it's the presence of purpose. The ridge was quiet, not an empty quiet, a full quiet, a quiet earned. Jack patted my shoulder once, the way old friends do when words won't do the job. "You reclaimed a place that never had a soul," he said softly. "Then you went and gave it one." I stood there a while after he went back inside, letting the breeze roll over me, listening to the muted sounds of life from the house behind me, the laughter, the footsteps, the fire crackling in the distance. All of it built on land that was finally, unquestionably, rightfully mine. But it was the purpose growing on that land that mattered more now. The storm had blown through. The noise had faded. What remained was the kind of peace a man can stand on. Firm, steady, real. And as the last light slipped behind the mountains, I felt something settle deep inside me. I'd fought for my land. But in the end, the land gave something back. Something worth every minute of the battle. Something worth every mile of quiet ahead.